I made a video a couple of days ago about this idea of the self that we seem to have. I've been thinking some more about that. I mean, the first thing to say obviously is that when we think of the self, we're doing a kind of objectification exercise. We put the direct article, the word "the," in front of it and turn it into an object. But I can kind of understand that. But the thing I'm interested in right now is the extent to which this idea of a self, well, two things actually. Firstly, I just want to reinforce what I'm thinking about in terms of the emergence of this notion of a self. I guess I'm talking about a reflective self here, and just revisit the evolutionary logic that might underpin that. But also the relationship between self and body, which I think is really important. I mean, firstly, in terms of evolutionary logic, history, of all that kind of stuff, it seems to me to make perfect sense that that since we are developing some kind of a consciousness, some kind of self-reflexiveness, some kind of relationship to language, some sense that of understanding what other people experience when they experience us, it makes sense in that regard to have some kind of a self-image. And by that I don't just mean a visual image, I mean some kind of a sense of self which is reasonably coherent and which we can objectify and turn into a the self. Given that we have this kind of social dimension to our being, and we have for a long time, it would make a lot of evolutionary sense, it seems to me, to be able to mobilize that social being by characterizing it in the way I've just described. But the second thing is this relation to body, because the bottom line of all these evolutionary things, it seems to me, is to do with survival and reproductive success. Working through sexual selection and peer and the kind of natural selective processes. And given that situation, then it's got to, at the end of the day, it seems to me there's got to be a close relationship between our embodiment and our sense of self. To the extent I would imagine that the sense of a self that we have would probably draw on aspects of our embodiment as a template. So I would be surprised if the structure of our self wasn't in some ways reflective of the structure of our embodiment. Now I know a lot's been written about that. Thomas Metzinger talks really well about that in Being No One, and Antonio Damasio talks about it in a kind of different way, but he's talking about the relationship between kind of feelings and somatic processes and the generation of something you might call a self, and loads of other people as well, and that would make kind of sense. But what I'm thinking, and the particular starting point for me and all that actually is Mark Johnson's book called The Body and the Mind, where he's talking about, well, quite specifically, I mean it leads into talking about metaphor actually, but he's talking quite specifically about those things. Just going to get out of the way because there's an Alsatian coming and my dogs have got a problem with Alsatians. So I'm thinking about this book, Body and the Mind, and if I kind of read him correctly, or if I extrapolate from that correctly, what he's kind of saying there is just what I've said, that the formation of the mind, including such ideas like the self, uses as templates, as metaphorical structures, the structures of our embodiment. But my take on that, which I'm just starting to think about really, isn't so much that it's our embodiment as our body looks. It's not the shape of our bodies, it's not our body image. I don't think it's even necessarily our body schema in a kind of narrowly defined sense. We're not like this fantastic picture called the Penrose homunculus, which is this schematic version of what the body looks like in terms of its sensitivities. But I don't think it's even that. I think it's to the extent that our mind, including our sense of self, is built on the logic of the body. It isn't the body as an object seen from the outside, it's the body as a phenomenal experience from the inside. So I think it's more accurate to say that it's not so much the body actually as the sensorium which provides the template. It's the it's that system of, in mostly complementary, but in some ways competing systems of engagement that we have through the various sensory modalities we have. You know, there is a kind of order and a logic to the way that our senses connect to something we call the outside world and make sense of our experiences for us. And I would suspect that it's that complex of relationships which forms this template, rather than a kind of crude body image as a body seen from the outside. So if I can just kind of spin off some implications for what I'm talking about there. If it's our sensorium which provides the template for what our self is, then we would expect to see a structured self which matches the structure of that sensorium. So we might see aspects of our self which are represented by or representative of or are based upon those aspects of our sensorium which are very close and very internal and very highly subjective and almost unconscious. Things like the proprioceptive sense that keeps us from falling over, that tells us where our limbs are in space. And I can kind of feel my centre of gravity right now while I'm standing here. It's a really close and kind of fulcrum, really, or a kind of hub around which a lot of my experiences seem to be rotating. And then there are other kind of sensory engagements which are more peripheral, the skin being one of them. But that's only one of them. You know what I mean? The kind of the reach of my hands seems to also have a corollary in my understanding of what myself is, and the extension that my auditory system allows me to make into the space around me is also a kind of aspect of myself. I don't feel that I get to this level of my skin, I suppose, and then stop. I feel that in terms of this conceptual mapping, that there's a range of different boundaries and concentric Russian doll kind of configurations within this sensorium which structure the self, or structure myself, some of which are more central, some of which are more peripheral. I'm probably going right out. I mean, I'm looking out right now. I can't quite see the sun because it's too misty a day, but if I could see the sun, then my visual sensorium would be reaching out whatever it is, 93 million miles. And if I can see past the sun, then my visual sensorium reaches past that. And I think, you know, in many ways it's as valid to say that my sense of self has a corollary with that extension. It's as valid to say that as it does to say that my sense of self extends to the limits of my skin, because from the inside, my experience of my skin is just a sensation, every bit as real for me as my experiencing of the visual image of the sun in the sky or the stars at night. I don't think I made any sense there at all. I'll try and come back to this later when I've got more clear sense of what I'm talking about. I suppose all I'm saying is that that one way of perhaps looking at it is to think of the self as a series of modalities. So we'd have a visual self, we'd have an auditory self, we'd have an olfactory self, we'd have a tactile self, or a haptic self to do with touch. We'd have some kind of gustatory or taste-oriented self. We'd probably have a proprioceptive self, kind of based on the location and the relationships between the body parts. But we'd probably also have some more kind of intimate understandings of self, which are undoubtedly functioning as brain activity, if nothing else, to do with the workings of the body, really. Which there are senses in the body which we are undoubtedly being monitored by our brains that we just can't detect, or that we can just about detect if we're really good at that kind of interoceptive processes of listening to your own heartbeat or feeling the churnings of your own stomach. But there's bound to be more which are even more subdued and quiet and pass completely under the radar of conscious awareness, but are nevertheless sensed and and which are very up close and personal and internal and central and core and all those kind of things. I don't know. I think that's about it really. Just that there's one potential model is that all these different selves, which would undoubtedly be all different from one another, have different properties, be in complex, different relationships to one another. The one that I just mentioned was to do with proximity. So the visual self extends out to the horizon of one's visual field, the end of the universe, effectively, and those kind of highly somatic and proprioceptive senses are conceptually located at the centre of one's being and not extended out at all. So, but I'm guessing there's all kinds of other kind of potential relationships for different understandings of what a self is, and how those different sensory modalities turned into templates can interrelate.